The way that I farm carp causes some controversy amongst some of the industry's old guard, and I couldn't give a monkeys, and by the end of this video I hope you'll discover why. Today we're harvesting one of my ponds of 4-year-old carp. At 4 years of age, the male and females are both sexually mature. Last year's crop of C4s had a successful early spawning, and we had thousands of first-year carp that reached a really good size at harvest. Needless to say, I was very excited for this year's crop of offspring. Last winter I purposely selected some of my favourites for this pond in the hope that they would naturally produce a crop of offspring which share the same looks and growth attributes of their parents. If you're new to my channel and you're wondering why I consider my feeds to be controversial and why the industry professionals poo-poo the idea of how I farm fish, well, it all goes down to what I feed them, and every single fish in this video is farmed and reared on feeds that I produce myself. They're all plant-based diets. They're not nutritionally complete diets that our industry is led to believe that you need. I don't use extruded aquafeed diets that are designed for commercial aquaculture. I just supplement my ponds with a plant-based diet. And the reason that I get away with that and that I can produce fish of this standard and get them growing as quick as any fish farmers without those nutritionally complete diets that are pumped full of protein and fat is because I know how ponds like to function. I'm very lucky that I've spent my whole professional career in fishery consultancy and have seen lots and lots of fisheries all over the country and locally, and we've been to them annually, year after year, seeing what they've done right, seeing what they've done wrong, and starting to draw parallels between lots of different businesses. So I've had that benefit of seeing other people's businesses, other people's fisheries improve and fail on different terms. And that's where I've come to the conclusion that you do not need to be feeding potent diets to your fish. It's all about their environment, and that is where I spend my focus. That is what my business is all about, is improving the environment in which your fish are living. And that is how you can improve your fertility of your fishery, to improve the natural sources of nutrition within that water body. And that is where I spend my focus. That is what you're going to learn in my content and how I teach and lead fisheries to see a healthier alternative to pumping your fish full of processed protein and high fatty diets. Every single fish in this video is produced on our feeds, so pay close attention to the quality and the size of these fish and just tell me whether you think they're any different to any other fish farmers in the industry. And that's why I'm controversial, because I have a different opinion. The first sweep removes the majority of the fish. We do this by draining the water down to crowd all the fish into the deepest bowl of the pond. I then work the leads through the sill and under the fish to crowd them into the bank. Once the leads are completely in, the fish can't escape. They are then crowded tight enough to remove them by hand. Any fish that are above 2 pound I generally remove by hand to protect their fins from the dip nets. The fish are picked from the net and placed into fish bins with a small amount of water before they're hauled up the bank and into the awaiting transport tank, where neat oxygen is being supplied to them. They're then transported back to the holding tanks for grading. That first day is all about getting the bulk of the fish out the pond with the seine net, and then on day 2 we drain it down with a water trash pump. It's a 3-inch Honda trash pump that we just pump out the last little bowl that's below the overflow pipe. So when you're designing a pond, you want to have the overflow pipe above so the water can't drain completely dry out of there, because if anything was to happen, any disasters in the summer, or if that elbow was to come off the overflow pipe, then your pond would drain completely dry and you'd lose all the fish down the pipe. So you always have an amount of water below the overflow pipe, so that when you do drain it dry, your fish are in a pool at the bottom and they're not all completely drained dry where you lose them all. So it's a little bit of a fail safe, if you like. So day 2 is all about draining that final bowl all the way down. We could have probably squeezed it all into the first day by starting the pump when we first shot the first sweep, but I wasn't really sure what to expect with the fish and sorting them out. My head is always a little bit of a mess on days like that, and the plan usually changes 2 or 3 times before we change it back again. So in my head, I wanted just to get the bulk of the fish done in one day, and then on day 2, we'd start the water pump up nice and early in the morning so that we can drain it down and pick the last few out on the second day to make it less rushed as well, because it's been such a wet summer and again a wet winter. The fields of the logistics of getting the fish from the ponds back to the farm was a bit of a challenge with all that weight coming back up the hill through the wet valley. So we decided to do the second part of the harvest on day 2. It's now 5 o'clock the next day, which I'd planned to get up at 4, go and start the pump so I can get a full tank of petrol's worth of pumping out of the pond, so that by the time everyone's here, we're ready to start picking fish out of the mud, sort of 9-10 o'clock hopefully. But yeah, I've got down to the pond at about 4:30 this morning, and it's frozen solid. This is not what we want to see. Slowing things down a little bit. I should have that pumping right now, but it's frozen, it's not turning over, and that was running perfectly when we left it last night. So it's the curse of the fish harvest, and these bloody pumps just seem to be cursed. Every single winter I learn a little bit more about these pumps and manage to mitigate any issues, another issue every single winter it seems, but this is one I've not encountered yet, and it's a winter at the minute where we've not had any frost. It's the first frost, it's a big one. It's really frozen solid out there this morning. And in the past, I've learned that you shouldn't leave this E10 unleaded petrol in a tank, because that can go stale over a summer, and these pumps I only use in the winter. So I mitigated that this time. I had the pump dry all summer and refueled it with fresh fuel yesterday, and it ran sweet as a nut. And then we have this issue with the ice. So it's frozen up, got it in front of the blower in the office at 5 AM when it should be pumping water. I'll give it an hour and hopefully it will start to thaw out and we'll be going again. But it's going to delay the day a little bit, which is really frustrating. Hopefully the boys don't mind hanging about whilst the pond pumps down. But there we go. Hopefully this pump will thaw out and things will start to get better today. Whilst that meant that we were a lot more organised on day 2 with just the final fish to pick out, it did mean that those fish were sat in a small amount of water overnight. So the remaining, say, a foot or 2 of water, the fish were sat in there, the remaining ones that we missed with the net. Any holes that we might have missed them in, they were able to just sit overnight in that water, which interestingly, we noticed on the second day, lots more leech on the fish because they were that much closer to the lake bed overnight. Whereas on the previous day, when we netted the pond that had been drained quite quickly, the fish were obviously staying very active, very hard for the leech to get hold of them. We only noticed a handful of fish which maybe had the odd leech on them and the odd argillus. But on the second day, there was noticeably a lot more leech and lice on those fish because they'd been laying dormant overnight in that shallow water, a very, very easy target for those leech and lice, which is a lesson in itself, is why we try and keep fish active in the summer. To stop that happening in the summer, you want to keep those fish away from the leech and lice, make them a hard target for them, and that is a really good lesson to show you just how quickly those leech can get hold of those immobile fish that are just laying in that puddle. Like I've already mentioned, we put some of my favourite fish in this pond last winter to use them as brood fish. But you'll notice that the C1 fish, the natural offspring, didn't actually make very good weights as they have done in the past. In the past, we've had them get to 6 to 8 inches in their first year, which is a really good C1 size, which we like to carry on that progression into C2, and they generally become big C2s, big C3s, big C4s when they have that really good start. Now, interestingly, last summer was 1.5 degrees colder than the average summer temperatures. So we had a milder summer last year. We had smaller offspring, and really what those offspring want when they hatch, they want a food source once they've absorbed their egg sac. So we want a really good algal development in that pond. That single cell algae needs to be thriving once those fry hatch, and I think in 2024 we just didn't have that really strong UV sunlight in the spring to kickstart that algal development. So when those fry hatch, they've got those single celled algae, they're surrounded and thrive in a thriving environment which is full of daphnia, full of copepods, and they are all feeding on that single celled algae. So we didn't have that algae development early on, which was probably why these first year carp didn't do so well this year, and that is the drawback of harvesting fish naturally outdoors. You can't control the environment. However, next year I do think that to combat that issue that we had in 2024 with the poor start, when those fry hatched, and I wanted it to be just that little bit more fertile, so that when they've absorbed their egg sac and they're completely dependent on their external source of nutrition, that's where I think I could do better this year, and that's when this spring I'm actually going to help to fertilise the pond with a little bit of manure. It's something that I used to do years ago when I first dug the ponds to establish an algal bloom and establish the natural food chain. I'd surround the margins of the ponds with manure to kickstart that algae bloom and kickstart that food chain, and that's something that I've kind of neglected because the ponds have become more mature now. I've not done it for many years, and I think that's something that I could really optimise this time and really utilise that free source of nutrition by fertilising the pond with well-rotted manure, which we have plenty of because I live on a dairy farm. But thankfully, because my fish production here is a very small scale, I've actually decided to scrap the C1s this year. I'm going to keep C2s because they're much better, and I'm going to miss a year class. There's no point keeping fish that aren't going to make the best fish possible. So I think next year I'm going to focus on getting those C1s absolutely prime and scrap those C1s for this year, and instead I'm going to make sure that the 2025 offspring are absolutely awesome and have a fantastic environment once they hatch. And that is the beauty of having such a small scale fish farm. I can afford to just say, no, do you know what, I'm not going to keep those C1s this time. I'm going to focus on making a much better C1 batch for 2025. I've been very proud of the fact that there's only ever been one batch of carp brought onto the farm in 2013. That initial batch of fish I fed for a couple of years before they became sexually mature and successfully reproduced. From then on, I've always cycled my fish through the same system in this way. That single batch of 1,000 C1 carp are responsible for the thousands of pounds of fish that are produced here every year. However, in 2022, I realised that this way of cycling fish through the same system probably isn't sustainable long term, with the potential of the gene pool becoming too close. So I got in touch with Tom at Priory and purchased 350 C2s. So having selected some of my favourite Priories from that batch of 350, I'm probably down to 20 or 30 of my favourites that I really like the characteristics that I think will go great with my fish. It's going to be interesting to see what they produce, being the first year that they're sexually mature and in a brood fish pond with some of my sexually mature fish. When I made that decision to reach out to Priory, it wasn't an easy one for me because I'm always against the idea of introducing fish from lots of different suppliers, because I think, in my opinion, it's like Freshers Week. Lots of people getting together in a new environment, different pathogens coming from all over the country and meeting at one point. That freshers flu seems to drag on and on. I think if you're buying fish every year from lots of different suppliers, you're introducing new pathogens, your fish take a year to build immunity to them, and then you introduce more. So I think annual introductions of fish from different suppliers is never a good thing, because those pathogens generally and infections generally take place in the spring when spawning happens, and you're just kind of prolonging that, maybe the spawning period or any infection in the spring is going to really close that window of growth in the summer. That summer season, that growing season, will be squeezed if you start to sacrifice those early spring months and they creep into the summer months. That window of growth can be squeezed and squeezed. Fish carry parasites for sure. It's healthy for fish to carry parasites and build immunity against them, but I think different strains of different bacteria and pathogens generally mean that the immune system of fish, particularly if they're stressed, they're going to have to learn to defend against, and their immune system is going to have to build immunity against them by fighting it and overcoming that before they can recognise that pathogen the next time and it not to be a threat to them. But yeah, that's what I've done. It's done now. The fish came in 2 years ago. After, particularly the first year, they're probably a little bit steady, but then like I say, it fits with what I've just said, that the second year, once they'd overcome any foreign pathogens from my fish perhaps, or my fish overcoming any foreign parasites, pathogens of the fish I introduced, once they've had a year with them and they've kind of built immunity to each other's parasites, they seem to be thriving now and really growing and looking great. So they've settled in well now, and it's time for them to start producing the future of BP milling fish.